Hello and welcome to the Green Canary. I'm Ant Sharwood, and today on the show, we're going to be talking about the devastating Pakistan floods. Now, it's sad to say they're probably the world's worst weather-related natural disaster of the year so far. So we'll be talking about the effects of the floods and, of course, about the underlying climate change influence which is at play. We're also going to talk this week about a great debate that is raging between climate scientists. Say no more about that for now till we get there. And we're also going to take you to the place on Earth that you probably most associate with cars that's about to become the land of electric vehicles. Some great news there. Now, we're also going to be doing a few citations about cetaceans. Sorry for terrible wordplay. Yes, I know, it was awful. But I'm talking about dolphins, whales, and porpoises. People always forget about the porpoises. But speaking of porpoise, well, purpose anyway, seem to have had no purpose lately. Something has been missing from the Green Canary podcast. Ah, yes, of course, that something or that someone is Elfy Scott, who is back from Europe. Thank you, Elfy, for rescuing me. And how are you?
I'm great, thank you, and I'm still profoundly jet lagged, but it's okay. I'll push through it. And thank you so much for holding down the Green Canary fort while I was away. You had some great content going.
Yeah, we had a good laugh without you. We didn't make any jokes at all behind your back, tempted as though we were.
At least not ones that were recorded.
That's exactly right. But let's jump into it. I mean, this is not a great story we have to start off with, but we have to address it because it's an absolute disaster. I mean, you look at the East Coast floods that we've had in Australia in the last year or two, and they've been terrible. But Pakistan is just on another scale, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. This was news that I'm sure we've all seen rolling out in the past week. But basically, Pakistan is experiencing these massive, devastating floods caused by the heaviest monsoon rains in at least a decade. And I think they began nearly a week ago now, and they've been described by Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif as the worst in the country's history. So they've had record rainfall combined with melting glaciers, and that's led to, at least it was at one point in time, over a third of the country being completely submerged. So it's been absolutely awful to watch.
That's, I mean, a third of the country. And, you know, to put that in perspective for people, Pakistan is almost exactly the same size as the state of New South Wales here in Australia.
Oh, right. Okay.
So imagine if 1/3 of New South Wales was underwater. And now imagine that New South Wales was the fifth most populated country on Earth, which with 200 plus million people, which is what Pakistan is. So this has been a natural disaster on just a grand scale. And you mentioned the glaciers quickly. Pakistan, Elfie, has more than 7,000 glaciers.
Wow.
It of course has, I think it's got the most of any country outside the polar regions. Of course, the world's second highest peak, K2, is in Pakistan, up in the Karakoram. And the point of the glaciers is, I was listening to a scientist on this on America's NPR, actually. The glacial melt generally comes in very late spring, early summer. When the glacier melt combines with monsoon rains, that already puts added pressure on the river system. When one of the most severe glacial melts in the country's history combines with one of the most severe rainfalls in the country's history, you can imagine how much water goes into the rivers.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the human toll we have to speak about, because just the burden of this massive amount of flooding in such a contained area is really horrific. So what has happened is that 33 million people, or 1 in 7 Pakistanis, have been affected by this. 1,500 people have lost their lives, and 500,000 homes have been lost. On top of that, the agricultural industry in many parts of the country has just been wiped out, decimated, and the cost of repairing the damage to the country's infrastructure has been estimated at around $10 billion.
Yeah.
But Ant, as you mentioned at the top of this episode, like, we do have to talk about the climate change impact and, what we're actually seeing in terms of the data and the studies that are coming out about Pakistan's floods. So can we talk about what we can actually attribute to climate change within this story?
Yes, we can. These floods. but,
Yeah.
but, but it's never that simple. It's never that simple. You always have to use that line about, such events are made more likely and more severe when they occur. That is exactly the case here. But I believe we found a statistic, didn't we, where scientists said that, first of all, there were heat waves in Pakistan earlier this year, 49 degrees. Scientists said, well, the probability of getting that sort of temperature was upped by a factor of 30.
Mm.
Something similar at play with floods of this level. And I always I think, I'm a big fan of Antonio Guterres, not just because as an ant, I'm a member of the Antonio Club, but I just love his colorful language all year. And, in recent years, he tells it like it is. And he just does not speak like a bureaucrat, even though that's basically his job. He's chief bureaucrat of an international bureaucracy. And Antonio Guterres said, the Pakistan people are facing a monsoon on steroids. Wow. The relentless impact of epochal levels of rain and flooding. You don't hear the word epochal enough, do you? And
I don't know if I've ever heard the word epochal.
as in once in an epoch, as in just you don't see this. It's not a one in 100-year or 500-year or 1,000-year flood. It's a once in an epoch flood. And then he said, let's stop sleepwalking towards the destruction of our planet by climate change. Today it's Pakistan, tomorrow it could be your country, which I think was a really, really nice way of bringing it home for all of us.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think something else that I want to talk about with this story is really the issue of climate justice that comes up inevitably when we're talking about a country such as Pakistan experiencing these kind of floods as opposed to, say, Australia. Because I looked this up, and when I looked at the per capita CO2 emissions of Australians compared to Pakistanis, I found that Australians are, on average, responsible for about 15 tons of carbon emissions every year, and the average Pakistani is responsible for under 1. So we're really seeing this play out in real time. This thing that everybody has been warning us for decades will ultimately happen, is that the people who are least responsible for climate change are going to be the people who first bear the brunt of its effects. And I think that that's something we really got to keep in mind when we're looking at a story as devastating and horrific as this one.
That's a fantastic point. And we went there actually in the newsletter last week while you were away. I think I got a quote from Frank Bainimarama, the leader of Fiji, who said exactly that. He pointed at the developed world. He said, Pakistan's floods are the developed world's problem. You guys caused it. So, I think that issue of climate justice is well worth addressing always in contexts like this, and well done. And so what we need to do, of course, Elfy, is take climate science seriously. And that takes us to our next story rather nicely, doesn't it?
It really very much does. And this is such an interesting story that you found, Ant. So can you please tell me about what is happening with the IPCC and what people are suggesting should happen?
Okay, so I was alerted to this on the weekend by something I read in the ABC, but it relates to a scientific journal piece that was written December last year. Basically, 3 climate scientists said we should go on strike. We should stop doing climate science because no one is listening to us. These are people who've contributed rather to IPCC reports, and they basically just said, look, we call for a moratorium on climate change research until governments are willing to get their act together to fulfill their responsibilities in good faith and mobilize coordinated action from local to global levels. So what we've got is a bunch of scientists 3 who wrote the paper, who are sick of producing the research, the data, the reports, in many cases, the advocacy as well, and being ignored. So what the ABC did on the weekend in this story was they spoke to a few Australian climate scientists about it. It was good journalism by them rather. And one of them was Professor Mark Howden of the ANU, of their Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. And he wasn't so impressed, was he?
No. So he's been involved with the IPCC since 1991, and he actually claims to be the only person who has been involved in the second, third, fourth, fifth, and now sixth IPCC assessment reports. But basically, in the story on the weekend, he said that it is just not a great idea. And Ant, you actually spoke to Mark yourself, didn't you? You got him on the line to speak about these concepts and, what these scientists were actually proposing.
Yeah, when Mark Howden said, "No, we can't just go on strike. We can't just stop doing the science. That is not the solution," as you said, just not a great idea. So I thought, well, let's call him ourselves. Let's get Mark Howden on the line. Let's see. And I guess we'll play a couple of grabs from him. The first thing I did ask him was, I mean, did he think these scientists were absolutely serious, or were they just kind of playing devil's advocate to ruffle feathers a bit? Let's hear from Mark Howden.
We should continue to do some of the underlying science, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we should be ensuring that the science that we do is relevant, and it's supported and it's meaningful and it leads to good outcomes. And so for me, this is not a time for navel gazing. This is actually a time for stepping up and stepping out.
Okay, so Mark essentially told us there that there was like no way that climate scientists should stop producing climate science, right? And in actual fact, they should maybe do more of it, which I think is an interesting argument to come to this with.
Yeah, I think it is too. And good on him for standing his ground. And it is worth mentioning that Professor Mark Howden is from the ANU's Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. Very solutions focused guy. Love that about him. And so he thinks that the way to solve this issue is to keep feeding people with science. So next we sort of asked him whether the scientific community has a role beyond just researching, reporting, leaving it on the table in those sort of 4,000-page IPCC reports. Should they also go that extra step? This is a debate that goes on in the scientific community generally now on all issues. Do you just do the science, or do you engage with decision makers, which is particularly important in climate science? So I put that question to Mark Howden as well. Let's hear what he said.
Well, science community, like any community, is full of very different people. So some people just like to hunker down in back rooms and do their science. Other people, engage with the policy process and the political discourse. Overall, I think science has been incredibly effective in this topic of climate change. So, 90% of Australians acknowledge that climate change is happening. It's an issue on it. So that's the Lowy Institute poll that shows those numbers year after year after year. So I think we've actually been really effective at raising the issues about climate change.
So you can sort of see that, it's horses for courses. It depends what sort of scientist you are. Some sit in the corner, some prefer to engage. But I think, Mark Howden of the ANU, Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, I'll say it again, is very much a solutions-focused person. And he believes that this paper was a bit of a furphy. It's not his way of seeing it, but I think it was an interesting debate, and I hope people sort of enjoyed hearing about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? I think that even if you don't necessarily believe in what is written in this paper, I think at the same time, at least it really strikes up an interesting discussion. And they speak in the paper about, the contract between scientists and governments being broken. Like, what is the point of science if governments aren't acting on it? And, maybe it is a furphy. That's fine. But at least there's something to talk about here. And at least we can focus on these sort of bigger issues that they are pointing towards.
Yeah, that's right. And, I sort of put that to him, but it is not his role to get involved in tricky political questions. And when I say I put it to him, I said, hey, so we've got a government that, all right, it's put through some legislation to reduce emissions to 43% of the old levels. And yet at the same time, they've just greenlit 10 permits for offshore resource development / exploitation. what do you make of a government like this? He wouldn't go there. He
Mm.
doesn't want to get politically involved, but he does want to be a political advocate. It's a fine line, and I think he's treading it well, actually.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Now we are going to move into mulch. And this is the little part of the episode where we get to talk about the clippings, the interesting curiosity stories. And you have come to me with a collection of stories this week. So why don't you jump into it? Your first one is talking about California being set to ban the sale of new fossil fueled cars by 2035. Sounds like good news.
Yeah, it is. And there goes the clickbait, because I said to everybody at the start of the episode,
Oh no, I fucked up your clickbait. I'm sorry.
no, you absolutely didn't. No. It was time to reveal. It was time for the reveal. That's absolutely fine. So, I said a place you normally associate with cars, and the freeways of Los Angeles, and the smog, the famous smog that sits over that city, and well, perhaps it will be smog free in the future, because California is going to require all new cars, not existing ones, to be electric or hydrogen powered by 2035. That is exactly in line with what the ACT is doing here. It's what the EU is doing as well. I don't know why 2035 is the magic number, but that's the year that they're all sort of taking as their benchmark to kick this off. And there are 17 states that might go along with them, it seems, in America.
Yeah, totally. So so under the Clean Air Act, there are 17 states that are basically tied to California's rule system currently. Washington, Massachusetts, New York, Oregon, and Vermont are all expected to adopt the ban along with California. I think there are other states that are currently kicking and screaming and probably going to end up taking this to court. But you know what? At the same time, it does show that, there is going to be like some interesting progression with this in the US. But also, and like you said, we've spoken a lot about electric vehicles in the past. And I think that it's great to see these huge signals from government about these new cars. But like we have spoken about before, we just have to hope that these sort of rules come with like the infrastructure and subsidies needed for people in lower income brackets to actually be able to access these vehicles. So yeah, let's hope that we actually see progressive reform that includes everybody.
You are so justice focused and orientated, Elfy. You're such a good human being. All right.
I'm not a good human being. We've just spoken to people who are good human beings who've told us this before.
Well, look, let's talk. If you're not a good human being, let's talk about some good whales. Let's talk about the right whales. The southern right whales. Yeah, look, we warned you there'd be some cetacean stories. Southern right whales, we're starting with a bad one because we do like to end with a good one. And this isn't great news. The southern right whales are not calving as often as they used to in Australian waters, are they?
No, so this is like a key endangered species. I don't know how much you know about the southern right whale, but I've read about them before, so I happen to have this information.
Take it away.
But basically, they used to have like tens of thousands of these whales off the coast of Australia, and then during the 1800s, their population was just decimated. So now there are approximately like 3,000 individuals who live in Australian waters. And it seems like habitat destruction, underwater noise pollution, like getting hit by marine vessels, like these are all issues for the whales. But then also on top of that, climate change is the icing on the shit cake for them. And it seems to be causing some real problems with their food supplies. So as much as they were sort of bouncing back a little bit, and they have been returning to breeding grounds in recent years, it just seems like that sort of bounce back from being overhunted might be being interfered with by all of these other factors.
And the whole sort of issue here is that they're calving less often, or less, the calving cycle is increasing, isn't it? So they used to pop out a calf every 3 years. Scientists led by Curtin University researchers have now found it's more like every 4 or 5 years. So that is a really subtle signal that the species is in trouble. I think it's great work by those scientists, and maybe it's a blip. Maybe they'll be back to 3 years in a couple of years. Let's see.
Yeah, actually, and before we end that segment, do you mind telling me the story about why they're called right whales? Because this is pretty grim, and I think that we probably have to acknowledge this.
Well, I just looked it up yesterday because I've always thought it was a stupid name for a whale. I mean, why
it is a stupid name, you're right.
I mean, I don't want them to be called right whales. I want them to be called, southern awesome whales or something. But Look, it's disputed. It's disputed historically, but
Oh, okay.
one of the favored theories is that they were the right whale for hunting because they swam near the shore, tick, easy to get to, and when you harpooned them or whatever you did to them, they floated on the surface. Maybe some whales don't, I don't know. And they were easy to drag back as well. So they were just the right whale if you wanted to go and get some blubber. Um, just terrible stuff. I don't want them to be right whales. I want them to change their name. Maybe that's not the reason. Maybe there is a better reason. That's the one I read.
Okay, well, I mean, I think it's a good reminder, and maybe you can lead the campaign for the renaming of the right whale in the future.
I can get around. Absolutely, I can get around that. And the campaign I mentioned in the newsletter recently, which we're about to get onto, about soy sauce fish. I mean, they're not real fish, but while we're talking about the oceans, those little soy sauce fish, that's going to be my campaign because nobody should take a soy sauce fish away with their sushi, pour some on from a bottle at the point of sale, and leave it there because they're terrible little things, those soy sauce fish. All right. But we promised you some good cetacean news. Please help me with the bottlenose dolphins. What's going on?
All right. This is actually a really nice story, and I've never seen anything like it before. But 3 bottlenose dolphins have been freed from their captivity in Indonesia back into the ocean this week.
Fantastic.
So these 3 dolphins, they were rescued from this like tiny, like shitty, cruel pool in a resort hotel, and they'd been sold to that hotel after years in a traveling circus. So they just have like a
Hang on.
terrible life.
Dolphins were in a circus?
Okay, I read this and I thought the same thing. I did not look it up, but I want to leave it to people's imaginations.
Wow, that's just so cruel. That is so terrible.
I know. But they were picked up from the hotel by this rehabilitation group from Bali, which is weirdly headed up by a guy called Lincoln O'Barry, who I would love to speak to because his father, Rick, founded the organization after he worked as the dolphin trainer on Flipper. So
Wow.
Rick ended up hating what he'd contributed to in terms of like the captivity of dolphins, and then he dedicated the rest of his life to trying to release them. That's what the organization does, and that's what they have done with these individual dolphins. So now they're healthy and strong, and they're in the ocean.
I just wanted to be there when the bottlenose dolphins were released. It would have been like the final scene of Free Willy. Have you ever seen Free Willy, Elfy?
Oh God, so many years ago. Should I watch it again? Is it a
I
good
don't
movie?
know. Just go and watch. I did this last night. I watched the last scene. It's on YouTube. And you know, the boys standing there and Willy's got to jump over the thing and go on, Willy, I believe in you. I believe in you. And Willy goes, and then Willy jumps. And Willy's free.
Oh my God. Okay. All right. Everybody's got to go and watch Free Willy, but then also we've got to cut up the audio of Ant making the whale noise and haunt him with that for the rest of his life.
Please
These are 2 jobs.
Maybe we should end the podcast.
Maybe we should. All right. That is all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us for the Green Canary. As always, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're recording, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We'd like to pay our respect to elders past and present and acknowledge that this land was stolen, never ceded.
Thank you, Elfy. And someone told me I got it right last week as well when I acknowledged the Yaitmatang people when I brought you the podcast from the Victorian Alps. So phew, got that one right. That was off the top of my head when I forgot all about the acknowledgement. At the end, I went, oh, I've got to do that. Pretty sure the local folk are the Yaitmatang. Oh my gosh, I am so glad I got that right. And I can tell you a story about the Yaitmatang people, but I might save it for another pod. So I'd just like to remind everybody, hello@thegreencanary.co is where to email for our weekly newsletter and all your Free Willy news. And please talk to us on social media. We are at Green Canary Pod on Twitter. We are at Green Canary Media on Insta. We're about to ramp up our Insta and do a few things there. So get around us there. And we will see you next week on the Green Canary. I think I better go out with a I believe in you, Willy. I believe in you, Elfy.
God.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.